Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 110. Well, stay tuned for some more glory in our midst this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux. Welcome back, Todd.
Thanks, Chris. How are you doing tonight?
Doing well. How about you?
Yeah, no complaints.
Good. Well, before we dive right into our topic this week, I will just run through our regular housekeeping that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. And also, if you could give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcatcher, both of those things really help boost our visibility to others as they are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is much appreciated and really does encourage Todd and me. So thank you to our donors. We really appreciate that. And now, Todd, should I turn it over to you, or do you want me to read the passage that Kline will be covering in our section of Glory in Our Midst? Or
Yeah, let me just bring everyone up to speed. If you have the book in front of you, we're on page 71. If you simply want to follow along in the scriptures, we're at Zechariah chapter 2, and it's the first 13 verses. But why don't you read verses 1 through 5 for now, Chris?
Okay, so this is Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then I said, "Where are you going?" And he said to me, "To measure Jerusalem, to see what is its width and what is its length." And behold, the angel who talked with me came forward, and another angel came forward to meet him and said to him, "Run, say to that young man, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. And I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst."
Thank you. Well, Kline begins this section by talking about prophetic idiom, and he brings up Ephesians 3, where the Old Testament is considered a mystery that has now been revealed. And you can see, especially as you listen to what you just read, that it was very difficult for the Old Testament Israelites to understand exactly what this meant. Now, they could get some general ideas, of course, but it wasn't until Christ came and the new covenant began that you could look back and really understand fully the meaning of these symbols and idioms. And especially, Kline points out the inclusion of the Gentiles. In one sense, the Jews were really caught off guard with the new covenant of how the Gentiles would be included in the people of God. But Kline points out there was enough to see that in the prophetic idiom, even in our passage, and especially Zechariah 2, the second half that you'll read a little bit later. And so we're at this third vision, and the vision is divided into two scenes. Verses 1 and 2 is the first scene, and then verses 3 through 5 is the second scene. And then from 6 through 13, you have an exhortation. This is what you are to do about the vision. This is what the vision means. And Kline points out that the way Zechariah is arranged, you have visions 1, 3, 5, and 7. After the visions, there is an exhortation. There is a preaching section, which is an applications of what these symbols mean. And so because we're in 3, we have another exhortation like we saw in 1. And so this second half, 6 through 13, even though it's an exhortation and even though it's an explanation of the vision, it still is part of the vision. You should imagine Zechariah actually hearing the words as part of the vision. And so the first imagery that Kline brings out in general is the Messiah and the metropolis, the city. And so it begins with a messianic measurer of the city. And so we have this measurer who Kline points out is the speaker throughout. It's a little confusing because of the pronouns. You have a lot of his and him, and you're not quite sure sometimes. But Kline points out that the measurer, the one holding the measuring line in verse 1, is the speaker who answers Zechariah. Zechariah is the young man of verse 4. The speaker is the other angel in verse 3. So it says in verse 3, and behold, the angel who talked with me came forward, and another angel came forward to meet him. So the angel who talked to me goes back to chapter 1, where there was an angel who had been explaining the visions. That angel returns here. But the angel who goes to that angel and speaks is also the measure, and it is the Lord himself, as we saw with the one who spoke in chapter 1, sitting on a horse.
Okay.
Because after he speaks in verse 5, we see that this measure, who is later called an angel, is divine, declares the Lord. It's the Lord speaking. And so that's how to understand who are the characters in this vision. We have the angel of the Lord, who is the measurer, and then briefly have we the angel who's an interpreter, and then the young man who receives the message in verse 4 is Zechariah. And so the exhortation of 6 through 13 continues the speech of verse 5. Notice how the angel, who is the angel of the Lord, speaks and says to the other angel, say to that young man, and then here's the substance of that. But that continues in verse 6 all the way down to verse 13. And so it's picking up the promise of chapter 1, verse 16, where it said, I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem. And so that idea returns where you have the measure with the measuring line. And Kline brings up Jeremiah 31, that another promise of a restoration of Jerusalem. And the question is in verse 2, what is the measure measuring? Is he measuring something that already is? In other words, is he measuring Jerusalem as it is there? So it would be the idea of sort of showing that he knows exactly what God's people are going through. He knows exactly how large things are. He knows what is. Sort of like Kline points out in creation, when God sees it, and then he declares it was good.
Okay.
But Kline points out that's not the proper way to understand it. Because the Hebrew verb that's used here for measure is also translated in other places as providing. For example, Genesis 22:8, the Lord provides a lamb.
Okay.
And so what Kline is suggesting is that the measure is marking the perimeters of the future Jerusalem, what the Lord will provide for his people. And so the Lord declares a promise, and he did that in chapter 1, that Jerusalem will be restored. And now we have the one who's sort of marking out exactly how it will be restored, how large it will be, how he will provide for that promise to come true. And Kline brings up in Revelation 11, you have Christ measuring, and he's measuring the city, and that's a picture of him rendering a divine verdict of what will not be allowed in the city. And so you have, just like God measured creation in the book of Job, and then he created, he's measuring, the Creator Lord is measuring his new creation boundaries. And that's what this pictures. The measure, the Lord himself, really Christ, is measuring the new creation, the new Jerusalem that will be the fulfillment of this promise of a restoration of Jerusalem. He's measuring it, and that includes how large it will be, and who will be allowed in and who will not be allowed in. And that introduces this idea of a restoration of the city that was promised in chapter 1. That's a difficult section when you first read it because of the way it's written, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And, when Kline walks you through it, it just really, I found it very clarifying and helpful. But it's almost like God is what we in the United States would call a contractor. Over in Ireland and the UK, they'd call them builders. But, someone who's going to construct a building, and they're out there taking measurements in order to start, pouring foundations and putting up walls and things like that.
Yes, exactly. And so Kline points out that we have here a measurement of the city of glory, of the future Jerusalem, the fullness, God's church, his temple. And in verse 4, the emphasis is on the fullness of the city. Notice how it says, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls. And so it'll be who will be full of. And then in verse 5, of the glory of the city, the focus is its glory. And I will be to her as a wall of fire around it, and I will be the glory in her midst. And so you have the two aspects of the city, how full it will be, who will be there, and then what it will be made of. It will be of God's glory, verse 5. And so we have an eschatological Jerusalem here. And notice it's an open country. That's why it says there won't need to be a wall. Jerusalem will be inhabited as villages without walls. And that emphasizes, one, the safety of it, because you built walls to protect.
Mm-hmm.
But this city will not need protection from enemies. God will be the protector, and he will have defeated the enemies. But secondly, there's an opening of the walls to let others in, to expand the length and width of the city. And Kline points out, again, this is a fulfillment of what we talked about in Kingdom Prologue in Genesis 9.
Right.
Where in the oracle to Noah, remember Shem's tent would be open to the children of Japheth.
I remember that conversation because we were talking about how you and I were living that out, Jew and Gentile,
exactly.
on the podcast.
Exactly. And then he quotes Isaiah 54:3, where Isaiah writes, enlarge the place of your tent. Yeah. So we have God's house, but it will be enlarged. And that's the same picture here. God's house, here his city, will be made much larger. The walls will fall down because it'll be so large. And Kline says that imagery is fulfilled where it says in Acts 14, God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. The door of the city is now wide open, and Gentiles inhabit the holy city with the Jews.
Okay.
And so the image sort of moves from Genesis 9, the image is a tent, to Zechariah 2, the image is a city. But both were different pictures of God's house, his palace. And so God's glory fills her, which Kline points out also reminds us how his name was promised to be on Shem, that they would experience his glory in a good way. Now it will be on Shem and Japheth. The Gentiles will come in and experience his glory, which is another way of the fulfillment of Genesis 9. God's name will be on them. And so you have a promise of a city with overflowing population. And thus the wall of fire then, in verse 5, is a sanctifying boundary, Kline writes. Just think of the guardian angel at Eden, protecting God's holy presence. So now you have a wall of fire protecting God's holy presence, his people.
Okay.
It's interesting that, and then verse 11, and we'll read that in a moment, speaks of other nations who were formerly outcasts joining that city. And so we'll read that in a moment. And so you have the angel of the Lord here being sent by the Father, who becomes a fire. And Kline points out he's the one that takes the flaming sword onto himself in judgment to enable us to live in the very holy fire and presence of God and be safe. And so we talked about this before, that the burning bush, the reason it didn't consume the bush when Moses saw it, it's a picture of God's presence and glory being protected by grace. In other words, sinners are not being consumed because of what God would do for them in saving them from their sin. And so normally if sinners come into the presence of a holy God, they're consumed.
Right.
But this wall of fire is not consuming, it's protecting. Why? Because Christ would take our punishment in our place. And so the wall of fire becomes a sanctifying boundary for us because of what Christ did.
Not only God with us, but God for us.
Yes. And so Christ takes up on a number of roles in this vision. He is the one measuring, he is the one protecting, but he is the one that is going to be consumed by the Father in our place, so his presence would not consume us, so we can live in this holy wall of fire in this vision. Well, that brings us to the second section, so I'm going to ask you to read verses 6 through 13, if you don't mind.
No, not at all. Verses 6 through 13, Up, up, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord. For I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heavens, declares the Lord. Up, escape to Zion, you who dwell with the daughter of Babylon. For thus says the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall become plunder for those who served them. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come, and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord. And many nations shall join themselves to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in your midst, and you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. And the Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, before the Lord, for he has roused himself from his holy dwelling.
And so you have the two scenes of the vision. First you have the man measuring, and then you have the angel speaking, coming forward in the second half, or the second scene. And then the angel of the Lord, or the Messianic angel's sermon. And that started in verse 4 with run. You see the quotations there if you're looking at your Bibles. And that goes all the way to the end of verse 13, is this sermon based on what was in the vision. So the words are directed to all the people of Zion, not only Zechariah. As we see, he addresses verse 10, he calls them the daughter of Zion, which includes all God's people there. And we see then that the restoration of Jerusalem that was predicted and symbolized with the measuring stick in verse 2 is going to be preceded by warfare, first of all, because you see a warning that what God will do to the nations, that he will judge them first. And then as a result, his people would come out and then be part of this holy city. And we'll see in a moment, there's another way God will show conquest, and that is through conversion. But we'll start with the conquest of the nations. And so he addresses Israel as if they're still in captivity, which is very ironic because they've just been brought back from Persia. They're finally in the land. But he speaks to them as if they still have to escape from Babylon. And that shows that everything that happened with Israel is only a picture of what the gospel does and not the gospel itself. Because even though physically they are not really in captivity in a literal sense, spiritually they still are. They still need the work of Christ to save them from their sins.
Right.
They still need the Messiah. And so he speaks to them in this symbolic form as if they're still over there. And it's very interesting that Matthew's genealogy is organized into groups of 14 that sort of leads to a Jubilee year. So even though they weren't under captivity at the time of Christ, spiritually they were. Mm-hmm. They still needed the freedom. And so that's how even Matthew's genealogy is organized, to lead to a Jubilee deliverance. And so we see again how the exile and return pictured judgment and then redemption. It pictures a greater exodus than the one they experienced simply coming back from Babylon and Persia the first time. There still needs to be a spiritual exodus. There needs to be a deliverance from sin that is only pictured here by Babylon. So you have a double imperative here: flee Babylon and come home to Jerusalem. Leave Babylon, who is about to be judged, and come to experience my blessings, my presence. And then in verse 6, you have this idea that, for I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heavens. And Kline points out this spreading is good news. In other words, it's another way to say, I'm expanding you as a people around the world. And as we know, that never happened really in the Old Covenant like that. This is a picture of the inclusion of the Gentiles.
Right.
And the outward expansion of the church from Jerusalem in the New Covenant. And so verses 8 and 9, we have coming judgment over the world powers that are threatening God's people. I will shake my hand over them, and they shall become plunder for those who serve them. And so again, the idea like Egypt, which the Israelites were able to receive their plunder, the same type of things will happen again. God will come. In verse 8 it says, and he sent me after God's glory. Some of your translations, probably the best translation, with God's glory. So this conqueror who is coming with the glory of God in judgment. And Kline points out, remember that in 5b, the second half of 5, that's what the Lord is promising, that God's glory will be with his people. And now God's glory is going out to judge the nations. But when God comes in that type of judgment, we would expect it to be seen. There's a Shekinah glory. And it goes back to our conversation where before the time of Moses during the patriarch, when God appeared, he appeared in a theophany that was fairly hidden. And so the angel of the Lord, for example, that appeared to Abraham looked simply like a man. He wasn't shining in that Shekinah glory. And yet when God appears before Israel, now that part of the before they're entering the promised land, before it's a picture of heaven itself, now God comes in his Shekinah glory. And so now you have this, God is coming in his return, and we will see it. The glory of the Lord will accompany the one who brings judgment as well as the eschatological victory. So that same theme that we've already seen throughout the Old Testament continues here, even in the vision, as it's looking ahead to the eschaton. Let me stop and get your thoughts on that.
The coming with glory almost reminds me of Israel going with the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of the Covenant, traveling with them. Am I on to anything there?
Because the Ark represented God's glory, presence?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. And the fact that when the tabernacle was built, while they're still in the wilderness, it didn't fill up with, it wasn't the same glory as the temple. It was,
right.
I should say fill up, but it was, you took it down quickly and it was made of lighter things. The outward glory of the temple was much greater as it pictured the final resting place of the Lord, the palace of the Lord.
True.
And so when these things are being described, we should expect that outward glory to be seen as it's predicted here.
And this is part of that same prophetic idiom, right? Where the prophet Zechariah is using imagery that would have been familiar to Israel, and that kind of God, that glory presence of God, using that to describe the coming new creation, which is really what he's seems to be focused on in terms of the construction of the New Jerusalem and things like that.
And even in their own history, because Israel understood itself rightly as a new creation. And so when the new creation began, when God finally settled them, there was outward glory coming with it, the giving of the law, the temple, the smoke and the fire. And so their own history says when God establishes his kingdom, when he brings his new creation into its place, it comes with outward glory of the Lord. And so you would think they wouldn't be too surprised to see this as it looks ahead to the bringing in of the final kingdom. It's described in this way. And so Kline even points out with John 17, you have the same thing with Christ, is that for the most part, except for the transfiguration, his glory was hidden in the age of humiliation while he was on the earth. But when he rises from the dead, he's glorified. And, he even prays in John 17, glorify me with thine own self. There's a resurrection glory as he enters his kingdom. And so then Kline brings up this point of this phrase, the apple of my eye. This is not the only place, of course, we see this in the Old Testament. But in Hebrew, it sounds close, if I would say it in Hebrew, to the daughter of Babylon. So there may be sort of a play on phrases comparing. The daughter of Babylon, you're the apple of my eye. But Kline points out that the second half of verse 8 supplements the first half. In other words, they're the apple of his eye, especially as the nations were trying to hurt them. And so because they were the apple of his eye, that's why God is judging the nations, which is the first half of verse 8. The nations will plunder because you've touched the apple of my eye. And so he's telling them in this vision, flee the nations, they will be judged like Egypt. And in verse 9, that judgment would be, I will shake my hand over them. And that's reminiscent of Egypt. God's hand was over Egypt during the plague of the firstborn in judgment. And Kline points out that in many of the Isaiah oracles against the nations, there's that similar phrase, God shakes his hand over the nations.
Okay.
And so it's another picture of God's using his hand for judgment. And in the second half of verse 9, so that they will know the Lord sent me. And you will know the Lord sent me. And so the nations will surely finally know at judgment that Jesus was the Christ. And then God's people will know in a most intimate, personal way the fullness of what it meant that God has saved us. And so the Messiah and his mission is the main theme. What the Messiah would do and how he would reveal himself in the judgment of our enemies and the final salvation of his people, and restoring them to Jerusalem. That'll bring us to one final point, but let's stop there. Give everybody's brains a break, right?
That's right. Frequent rests to digest this material is good, are good. I guess I hadn't noticed the Isaiah references to God shaking his hand, and so as I was reading this section in Glory in Our Midst, I was kind of struck by that that language. But so it's tied in with the plagues in Egypt.
Yeah, there's a similar statement that God's hand was over Egypt.
Okay.
um, as as he judged them that way. And so it wouldn't be the first time that imagery was used in this particular vision, is Kline's point.
Okay. Before we move on, aren't some of the other prophets, I don't know if it's Isaiah, but it seems like Zechariah is not the only one to talk about the measuring line and that whole idea. Do we encounter that in other prophets?
Yeah, Ezekiel uses the measuring line.
Okay.
That's probably what you were thinking.
Yep.
I think Kline actually cites that in the book. But we see it again in Ezekiel, and then we see it again, as Kline points out, in the book of Revelation.
Okay.
Chapter 11. But really the glory part of this, and it's all glorious, but where we get information that we haven't really gotten as clear, depending on, when Isaiah was finished, is this conversion of the Gentiles in our next section. Because you have verse 10, which says, "Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord." And what Kline's suggesting is the reason to sing is what I'm about to tell you. So sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for what I'm about to do in your midst. Not simply that I will be in your midst, but what I will do. And then he begins to explain what he will do. Verse 11, "Many nations shall join themselves to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will be in your midst." So now you have a new aspect of the restoration. He's not simply speaking of the restoration of the Israelites, but many nations will join Israel in this restored, glorious Jerusalem, and they shall be my people. Again, reminding us of the same promise in Jeremiah 31. They shall be my people, and I will be their God. And Kline points out that the Hebrew word for join in verse 11 is the same word used in Isaiah 14:1, which says, "The Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Once again, he will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. And then foreigners will join them and unite with the descendants of Jacob." And so now you have more information that this city will not be a Jewish city. This will be Jew and Gentile together. And that's a recurring theme from here on in the book of Zechariah, that Gentiles will be full participants in the promises. For example, Zechariah 9:7 says the Philistines will become as chieftains in Judah.
Wow.
Which must have been amazing to hear if you're an Israelite, right?
Exactly.
Like, how is that going to happen?
I mean, wouldn't that be kind of like someone today hearing, and your neighborhood drug dealer and the prostitute down the street are going to sit down at the marriage feast of the Lamb with us?
Exactly. Yes. Yes, and the drug dealer will be an elder in your church, for example. The Philistines become as chieftains in Judah. What a great line.
I know. I mean, basically, dear listener, pick the category of person that you most want to see lost. Like the category you can't stand, that you want to see end up in hell. That's who God is saying, this is who's going to join us in the new creation.
Exactly. Yeah, it's amazing. And then Zechariah 14:6. It says, "The remnant from the nations will observe the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem." So you have Gentiles joining the Jews in their feasts. Now, Kline brings up a fascinating point, and that is early on in Isaiah, when Isaiah begins to write and predict about the inclusion of the Gentiles, it starts off with the Gentiles only joining Israel as their servants, but Israel as ruling over them. That's the image. And so there's sort of a halfway. Yes, they're not being judged with the world. They've joined God's people, but not fully equal. But as you move on in Isaiah, the language begins to change. There's a religious joining when they are equally enjoying the feasts. We saw that kind of thing in the book of Ruth, didn't we?
Yes.
First, Ruth is a squatter and she's poor. Then she's able to have a drink with the servants. Pretty soon she's having a drink with the master.
Right.
And then finally she's married to the master and is completely equal. And so you even have that progression in the book of Isaiah. But here in Zechariah, there's no sense that they're servants or anything less. They have full participation as these images speak. I mean, even what we just said, the Philistines will be as chieftains. They will be leaders, not simply servants.
Wow.
And so that leads us to the final point, and this is even just as amazing. In Isaiah 19, it talks about God shaking his hand over the Egyptians. But the result of that shaking is it leads the Gentiles to know and worship the true God. And so in that same chapter of Isaiah, it says, Egypt and Assyria will be my people. And so this shaking over the nations doesn't just refer to judgment when we think of judgment. It refers to conversion.
Okay.
That one of the ways that God will defeat the enemy is to convert them to friends. He will convert them to himself to be part of God's people. He will take conquest, but he will kill the old man through the gospel. And he will make them part of the new creation with Israel. So there's a twofold fulfillment of this shaking and this judgment.
Okay.
Part of it is the conquest through conversion. And boy, what a wonderful, powerful image, isn't it?
It really is. And it takes me back to Jonah. And may we not be like Jonah as we see God convert people that we might wish wouldn't be saved. But that's exactly how God is defeating his enemies, is by converting them and making them his friends and his children.
And doesn't this speak of the role of the church in our age?
Absolutely.
We're not... God is not coming in judgment until his return. And so that kind of conquest he will do at the second coming. The only conquest that's happening now, it's not us taking over the government, it's not us taking over culture, it's the conquest of the souls of the lost to bring them to Christ.
Amen.
And that they become part of this eternal city with us.
Amen.
So the role of the church is really clear here. This is what God is doing through the church. He's expanding the tent so they will come and worship God and know him. And so to redefine that conquest in any type of earthly control over non-Christians or culture is really, as Kline says, to prostitute the glory of this vision and the very specific role we have as a church to reach the lost. And that is a conquest. That is the powerful conquest of God in this age, is to kill the old man and to bring people to Christ in worship.
And it's so clearly God's conquest and not our own.
Yes, it's a spiritual conquest. There's nothing we can do besides preach the gospel.
Exactly.
Because the gospel is the power of God for salvation.
Amen. Wow. What a note
very
to end
powerful. I know, very powerful imagery, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I hope it's not lost on our listeners, just because, I mean, you can imagine the Israelites who heard this for the very first time being absolutely floored, hearing that Philistines would be leaders among God's people, that Egypt and Assyria would be called my people by the Lord. I mean, Egypt, who almost stood in opposition, well, did stand in opposition to Israel in terms of Israel's identity, coming out from Egypt. And Assyria even being like the Nazis of the ancient Near East.
Yes.
I mean, this should not be read over lightly or easily. I mean, God is basically saying he's going to take the lowliest of the most despised people and bring them into the fold to be his people with us. It's incredible.
Well, we'll stop there and we'll pick up on the next vision next week then. There may be a little bit more, I think, in the book to end this vision, but then we'll move on.
Okay, so we may have a bit of wrapping up of this vision next week?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Todd. I appreciated that discussion.
Sure.
All right, everyone. We would love to hear what you think. Please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux, and the podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. And you can also join the discussion at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast, and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again to talk to you next week.